Look at the device in your hand right now. Not the brand, not the model, not the glossy marketing story it was sold with. Look at what it is. A phone is not magic. A laptop is not innovation. An electric vehicle is not a moral upgrade that arrived from the future. They are all, at their core, refined geology rocks that were dug up, crushed down, purified, shipped, processed, and turned into a machine that fits in your palm. And without Africa's rocks, your device doesn't stay modern for long. It doesn't stay in the battery age without the Democratic Republic of Congo, because the DRC sits near the center of global cobalt supply, the metal that helps power the lithium-ion batteries inside phones, laptops, and especially electric vehicles. You can talk about clean energy all you want, but the battery doesn't care about slogans. The battery cares about chemistry, and chemistry cares about supply. It doesn't wire up the digital economy without Zambia, because copper is the quiet king of electricity. The wiring in your walls, the guts of transformers, the coils in motors. The bloodstream metal that connects power to everything we pretend is wireless. And then there's the invisible stability of your modern life, the parts nobody advertises. The high reliability, connectors, contacts, and components that keep hardware from failing depend on metals like gold. In Africa, that gold is not a luxury, it's an artery. Now just imagine the supply chain snaps. Not next year, not someday, tomorrow. Your screen doesn't just get expensive, it goes scarce. Repairs take longer. New devices slow down, prices jump. The whole ecosystem starts to choke, not because the world ran out of ideas, but because it ran short on the materials that ideas require to become real. The massive data centers training AI models don't run on vibes. They run on metal, wiring, power, cooling, industrial inputs tied to mineral supply chains. And when those chains seize up, the AI boom doesn't disappear in a puff of smoke. It stalls. It bottlenecks. And it becomes brutally more expensive to scale. The electric vehicle revolution, suddenly, it's not a glossy ad campaign. It becomes a manufacturing math problem. Battery materials tighten. Copper demand collides with copper reality. Rollout slow. Green transition timelines start slipping on live television. And the things nobody likes to say out loud begin to slip out anyway. That the clean future is mineral intensive. That the clean future is contested. That the clean future is political. And then there's defense, the part of the story people avoid because it makes everything feel too real. Modern military platforms are married to critical minerals, rare earth magnets, specialized materials. Advanced electronics ingredients show up across the systems that determine deterrence and dominance. The F-35 gets cited in this conversation for a reason. The modern weapon stack is not just steel and courage, supply chains. When supply chains get contested, procurement delays ripple outward. Readiness becomes a logistics problem. A slogan on national security becomes, quietly, a warehouse problem. We like to imagine the next world conflict will be fought over ideology, or maybe Taiwan. Something clean, something cinematic, something easy to understand. But the real war, the one that decides who owns the next century, is already happening. And it's happening in the red dirt of Africa, China, Russia, the United States, Europe. They are locked in a competition over strategic supply chains, critical minerals, processing, contracts, ports, power projects, and political influence. And no, none of them are there for charity. None of them are there to civilize anyone. None of them are there to rescue a continent. They are there because the ground contains the periodic table building blocks of the future. Battery metals. Industrial metals, the material foundation of everything from consumer tech to military capability. This is the new scramble for Africa. And if you think the first one was brutal, you haven't been paying attention to how modern power actually works. Because the old scramble was enforced by rifles, ships, and flags. This one is enforced by financing terms, processing choke points, export corridors, and the quiet ability to turn a factory on or turn it off. It doesn't look like conquest. It looks like partnership. It looks like development. It looks like infrastructure, ribbon cuttings, and glossy ESG reports. But under the surface, it's the same ancient logic wearing modern clothes. Whoever controls the input controls the future. And Africa is the input. Here's the twist that makes this story darker than the history books. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution needed Africa for rubber, palm oil, cotton, and minerals materials that fed machines. Today, the Fourth Industrial Revolution needs Africa for cobalt, lithium, tantalum, copper, rare earths materials that feed the machines that think, AI, green energy, advanced defense systems. We have changed the language. We have not changed the dependency. So when you hear politicians talk about national security, when you hear executives talk about supply chain resilience, when you hear influencers talk about the clean transition, understand what they're really talking about. A continent being pulled back into the center of global power. Not as a charity case, it's a battlefield. And once you see it like that, the device in your hand stops being a gadget. It becomes evidence. Evidence that your daily comfort is connected to minds you will never see, contracts you will never read, and political games you will never vote on, games being played by empires that learned long ago that you don't need to invade a country to control it. You just need to control what the world cannot live without. And right now, the world cannot live without Africa. In the next section, we're going to open the time machine back to the original scramble. The Berlin Conference, the ghost of King Leopold, and we'll watch the pattern repeat itself with new players, new branding, and a far more sophisticated kind of force. Because the question isn't whether the scramble is happening, the question is who wins it and who pays for it. Let's step into a time machine. The year is 1884. The vibe is almost absurd because history often looks ridiculous right before it turns monstrous. In Berlin, a group of European men sit in a conference room dressed like the world is civilized, immaculate suits, polished shoes, well-fed faces, and an almost supernatural confidence that God, progress, and law are all on their side. In front of them is a map of Africa, a continent that does not belong to them. And like toddlers fighting over a birthday cake baked by someone else, they pull out rulers and begin drawing lines. Not borders that reflect languages, ethnicities, trade routes, or history, just borders that reflect convenience. Rivers become dividers, mountains become excuses. Straight lines slice through living societies. "I'll take the Congo," says King Leopold II of Belgium. Not Belgium, the country. Leopold personally, because in that era, the distinction between a monarch and a corporation was often thin enough to tear. "I want the Gold Coast," says Britain. "Give me West Africa," says France. This was the original scramble for Africa, formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. No Africans in the room, no consent, no negotiation, only ink backed by rifles. Europe sold it as civilization, as commerce, as mission. But the engine underneath the story was the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution was hungry. It needed rubber for tires, palm oil for machines, cotton for mills, minerals for wiring. Extraction wasn't a side effect. Extraction was the point. Violence was the method. And the Maxim gun, the machine gun that could mow down resistance at industrial scale, was the enforcement mechanism. Now fast forward about 140 years. You might think we've evolved, might think we have the UN now. We have international law. We have ethics panels. We have ESG reports. We have sustainability pledges in tasteful fonts. Here's the bad news. The game didn't change. The players just got better at public relations, because we are now living through what economists call the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but instead of steam, engines, and textile mills. This revolution is built on artificial intelligence, green energy, and advanced defense systems. And here's the kick in the teeth. None of that high-tech magic exists without critical minerals. Not vibes, not speeches, not innovation slogans. Rocks, cobalt for batteries, lithium for energy storage, tantalum for electronics, copper for anything that carries electricity, meaning basically everything. Rare earth elements for motors, magnets, sensors, and weapon systems. It's easy to forget this because modern life is designed to feel weightless. Your apps float behind glass. Your data lives in the cloud, which sounds like it belongs to the sky. But the cloud is a warehouse full of servers. And servers are metal. Now zoom out and look at the numbers, because this is where the story stops being philosophical and becomes strategic. According to the International Energy Agency, the world is serious about hitting net zero goals by 2050, Demand for critical mineral inputs needs to rise dramatically, roughly 6 times current levels. And for electric vehicles specifically, demand for lithium, nickel, and cobalt could grow by 20 to 30 times by around 2040, depending on the scenario. So the obvious question is, where is all of this stuff? A massive chunk of it is in Africa. By many estimates, the continent holds around 30% of the world's known critical mineral reserves. The DRC supplies roughly 70% of the world's mined cobalt. Guinea sits on the largest known bauxite reserves on Earth, the raw ingredient for aluminum. Zimbabwe hosts major hard rock lithium deposits now being developed at speed, which means the scramble is back. But this time, it's not one empire carving up a map. It's a three-way cage match. Corner 1. China, the early architect. Beijing saw this coming while Washington was burning blood and treasure in the Middle East. Through the Belt and Road era, China didn't just buy mines. It built the roads to the mines, the power plants for the mines, the ports to ship the ore out. It didn't bring Bibles. It brought loans, engineers, concrete hand, timelines. And here's the part that matters most. China dominates the processing and refining stage, the step that turns raw minerals into usable industrial oxygen. It processes a huge share of rare earths and controls major capacity in lithium and cobalt refining. Translation: they don't just own dirt, they own choke points. Corner 2. Russia, the security broker. Russia isn't there to build highways. It's there to sell survival. As Western influence collapsed across parts of the Sahel, Russian influence rushed into the vacuum. Wagner became Africa Corps, but the business model stayed the same. You have an insurgency problem, a coup problem, a rival problem. Our guys can fix it. And in exchange, access to gold, uranium, and strategic concessions. It's not ideology. It's a protection racket scaled to a continent. Corner 3. The United States and the EU. The latecomers. The West wakes up around 2022 with a geopolitical hangover, looks at the map, and realizes it's behind. So now Washington and Brussels are scrambling funding corridors, talking about partnerships, rediscovering Africa with the urgency of someone who ignored the invitation until the music started. But in a world of hard assets, values compete poorly against railways, ports, and cheap financing. And that brings us to the real-world dilemma, one that plays out quietly in ministries every week. Imagine you're a government official in a resource-rich African country. It's Tuesday. At 9 a.m., a delegation from Beijing arrives. They slide a contract across your desk, $3 billion in rail, power, and public buildings. No lectures, no press conferences. They want copper rights for 30 years. At 11 a.m., Washington shows up, $200 million in aid, a 400-page compliance manual, and elections next year. And the money might clear Congress in 3 years. At 2 p.m., a Russian security consultant walks in wearing fatigues. He says he can stabilize your borders and silence your rivals. He just wants access to the gold fields. Who do you pick? This is not a hypothetical. This is the daily reality. And here's the dark twist. While people in the West argue about AI art, ethics, and reusable straws, the backbone of our digital lives is being pulled out of the ground, often in dangerous conditions, under the watchful eyes of superpowers treating the continent like a risk board. The green transition isn't clean. It's mineral-intensive, contested, geopolitical. We are trading oil dependence on the Middle East for mineral dependence on Africa. And right now, China controls the warehouse. So the scramble isn't just about profit. It's about survival, industrial survival, technological survival, national survival. Because if processed minerals get restricted, Western industries don't collapse overnight. They bottleneck. They stall. They bleed competitiveness. And once you understand that, you realize something unsettling. This isn't history repeating itself. It's history upgrading its tools. In the next section, we're going deeper into the machinery, into the model that changed the game quietly. Without tanks, without headlines. The blueprint that taught the world how to buy influence with roads, loans, and resource repayment. The Angola model. To understand how the new scramble actually works, you have to understand the moment the rules changed. Not loudly, not with a war, not with a declaration. Quietly, The year is 2004. Angola has just crawled out of a 27-year civil war that officially ended in 2002. The country is shattered. Roads are cratered. Rail lines are rusted skeletons. Power grids barely function. Hospitals exist more as ideas than systems. But beneath the wreckage, one thing is still flowing: oil. Angola does what countries are told they're supposed to do. It goes to the West. It knocks on the doors of the IMF and the World Bank. It asks for reconstruction financing. The answer is familiar. Yes, we can help, the West says. But first, lower your tariffs, privatize state assets, reform governance, improve human rights metrics, restructure your economy, pass the reviews. Wait 12 to 18 months, maybe longer. And then China walks in. Beijing looks at Angola's oil reserves and says something radically different. We don't care about your politics. We don't care about your elections. We don't care about your internal audits. We will build the roads. We will build the railways. We will build the hospitals and the power systems. Our companies will do the work. Our banks will front the capital, and the loans will be repaid with oil shipments over time. This wasn't charity. It wasn't aid. It was resource-backed credit. Angola said yes. And that decision became a blueprint. This is what later scaled into the Belt and Road Initiative. Arguably, it's the most ambitious infrastructure expansion in human history. While the United States was spending roughly $8 trillion fighting wars in the Middle East, China was spending around $1 trillion or more building the physical skeleton of global trade. Railways, ports, power plants, industrial parks, concrete instead of carriers, steel instead of speeches. They built the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, linking landlocked Ethiopia to the sea. They built the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya. They built ports from Djibouti outward. Parliament buildings, presidential palaces, highways, dams. And here's the part that still gets misunderstood. They weren't doing this out of generosity. Many of these deals were resource-linked infrastructure agreements. It's not always crude, barter, but a tight financial loop. China finances the dam. Chinese firms build the dam. Repayment flows back in oil, copper, cobalt, or export revenues tied directly to those resources. Critics in the West slapped a label on this: debt trap diplomacy. The idea sounds simple. China lends to countries that can't repay, then swoops in later to seize assets. But the reality is more subtle, and more dangerous. This isn't a trap. It's a monopoly. Because when China builds the infrastructure, it controls the path. If you're a copper mine in Zambia, the Chinese-financed road leads to a Chinese-built port, where a Chinese shipping company loads the ore and sends it to a Chinese smelter. No coup, no seizure, no headlines. Just logistics. Ownership is optional when you control the flow. And here's the uncomfortable truth for the West. This isn't something you can reverse with a press release. The United States is now trying to catch up. Europe too. There's new money, new partnerships, new rhetoric. But you can't download a railway. You can't 3D print a deepwater port. You can't fast-forward concrete curing. Infrastructure takes steel, cement, engineers, and time. And time is the one strategic resource the West burned over the last 2 decades. The dragon didn't rush Africa. It waited. And by the time everyone else looked up from the battlefield, the roads were already built. Which brings us to the most valuable square on this entire chessboard. The place where geology, human cost, and geopolitics collide hardest. The Democratic Republic of Congo. The blood in your battery. Now we zoom in. Not to a theory, not to a model, to a place. The Democratic Republic of Congo. If the periodic table had a VIP section, the Congo wouldn't be sitting at the table. It would be standing at the door with a clipboard, deciding who gets in. Because this single country sits on mineral wealth so extreme that depending on how you value deposits and future prices, estimates regularly climb into the tens of trillions of dollars. The number that keeps resurfacing in policy papers like a ghost is $24 trillion. But the crown jewel in this chapter isn't gold, it's cobalt. Cobalt is one of the metals that made the lithium-ion era possible at scale. In many battery chemistries, it stabilizes the cathode, helping manage the ugly trade-offs between energy, density, durability, and safety. No, it's not in every battery. Some EVs are shifting toward chemistries, like LFP, that use no cobalt at all. But here's the problem with the cobalt is obsolete story. Even as companies reduce cobalt intensity, the world still consumes a mountain of it. And the supply chain remains frighteningly concentrated. The DRC produces around 70% of the world's mined cobalt. Year after year, it's the gravity well of global supply. Prices swing. Narratives change. The dependency does not. For years, the most visible symbol of American presence in Congolese cobalt was a single industrial monster, a massive copper-cobalt complex that anchored the country's modern mining story. Then, in 2016, something happened that still makes strategic planners wince. A major American mining firm, under heavy debt pressure, needed cash. So it sold its stake in that flagship Congolese operation to a Chinese company for $2.65 billion in cash, plus contingent terms. On paper, it was just a business transaction. In reality, it was a strategic artery quietly changing hands. You would think someone in Washington might have paused and said, "This isn't just another mine. This is the fuel line for the battery age." But no, the sale went through. And as electric vehicles, grid storage, and AI infrastructure began to accelerate, a crown jewel of the cobalt economy moved deeper into China's orbit. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They argue about cobalt prices, booms, busts, oversupply, substitution. That's missing the point. The real lesson isn't about price spikes. It's about control of flow. Today, Chinese companies own, or hold stakes in the majority of the Congo's major industrial cobalt and copper-cobalt mining assets. Not all. Not total ownership. Enough that when you turn the valve on global cobalt supply, Beijing hears the water move. But there's another side to this story, and it's the one that never makes it into glossy sustainability decks. Not all cobalt comes from giant open-pit mines with heavy machinery and safety audits. A meaningful share phone estimated between 10% and 20%, depending on conditions, comes from artisanal and small-scale mining. That phrase sounds almost romantic. It isn't. Imagine digging a narrow shaft by hand. No helmet, no ventilation, no insurance. Sometimes no shoes. The tunnel drops tens of feet into the earth. You crawl inside. You chip rock and heat and dust so thick it coats your lungs. The tunnel collapses, no trained rescue crew arrives. You're buried. If you survive, you haul a sack of ore to the surface and sell it for a handful of dollars because the middleman has the trucks, the leverage, the connections. That or moves to a depot. The depot aggregates it. And then, this is the part that should make every Clan-Tech commercial feel like dark comedy. It can be blended into the broader supply chain. Eventually, it becomes part of a battery. Both Chinese firms and Western brands have spent years promising to clean this up, or at least promising to look like they're cleaning it up. Certification schemes, traceability pilots, audits, but demand pressure is relentless. When the world wants more batteries, the market develops an appetite. It devours what it can measure, and it devours what it can't. This is the moral paradox at the heart of the green transition. A revolution marketed as a futuristic ethical upgrade is tied to some of the grimmest labor conditions in modern supply chains. And right now, the pipeline that connects that mine to your pocket is dominated by Chinese industrial positioning ownership upstream, processing dominance downstream. But the story doesn't stop there. Because while China acts as the banker and builder, another power has carved out a different role in Africa's resource economy. Not as an investor, as an enforcer. In the next section, we meet the other side of the new scramble, the one that doesn't arrive with railways and spreadsheets, but with guns, helicopters, and an offer no desperate regime can easily refuse. Russia's protection racket. If China is the bank, Russia is the bouncer. While Beijing speaks the language of infrastructure, throughput, and 30-year contracts, Moscow speaks a much shorter, more brutal dialect, regime survival. To understand how Russia became relevant in Africa's new scramble, you have to look at the collapse of an old system. For decades, France played the role of regional enforcer in parts of West Africa, especially across the Sahel, through military operations. Thousands of French troops were deployed to fight Islamist insurgencies stretching across Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and beyond. The mission dragged on. The violence didn't stop. Civilian deaths mounted, and public patience collapsed. To many locals, France stopped looking like a security partner and started looking like a permanent landlord, one that couldn't fix the plumbing but refused to leave the building. Anti-colonial anger surged. Protesters waved flags. Governments wobbled. One by one, Sahelian regimes decided they wanted the French gone. That's when Russia walked in. Enter the Wagner Group, later rebranded, tidied up, and officially absorbed into what Moscow now calls the Africa Corps. The name changed. The business model didn't. Russia's pitch to African leaders is brutally simple. The West lectures you about democracy. The UN nags you about human rights. NGOs publish reports about massacres. We don't care. We will give you helicopter gunships. We will give you armed bodyguards. We will kill your enemies. And we will not ask questions. There's only one thing Russia wants in return: access, gold. In Sudan, where Russian-linked companies have been tied to extraction and smuggling networks. Gold and diamonds in the Central African Republic, where Russian operatives have embedded themselves so deeply that they influence security, customs, and mining concessions. Uranium roots, strategic minerals. Influence wherever regimes are most desperate to stay in power. This is the security for resources model. Look at Niger. In 2023, a military coup overthrew the elected government. The new junta moved fast. French troops were expelled. American forces who had built and operated a drone base costing over $100 million were ordered out. Soon after, Russian military trainers began showing up. Why does Niger matter? Because Niger has long been a critical supplier of uranium to France. Depending on the year, it has accounted for roughly 15 to 20% of the uranium feeding France's nuclear energy system. And nuclear power generates around 70% of France's electricity. Russia doesn't need to own Niger's uranium mines to matter. Control isn't always about ownership. It's about continuity, influence, leverage. When supply chains depend on political stability, the power to destabilize or stabilize them becomes a bargaining chip. And here's the darkly ironic part. The security Russia provides isn't very good. Multiple independent datasets from UN reporting to conflict tracking organizations show that in places like Mali, civilian deaths have increased since Russian mercenaries took over security operations. Terrorist attacks haven't vanished. In some areas, they've intensified. But that misses the point. The mercenaries aren't there to protect villages. They're there to protect palaces. For leaders facing coups, protests, and rival factions, that's the only metric that matters. This isn't counterterrorism. It's a protection racket scaled across borders. And business is booming. So now the board looks like this. China builds, Russia guards. The West hesitates. Which brings us to the moment Washington finally realized how far behind it was, tried to put a physical piece on the board. A railway, a corridor, a gamble. In the next section, we turn to the American pivot. The libido corridor, why speed, not morality, may decide whether it succeeds or fails. For nearly 2 decades, the most visible American presence in Africa looked like this. Aid programs, health initiatives, democracy workshops, governance language. And to be fair, those programs saved lives. Real ones, malaria nets, HIV treatment, vaccination campaigns, that mattered. But while the United States worked through grants and goodwill, China poured concrete. Then, around 2022, Washington looked up, checked the scoreboard, and realized it wasn't down 1 goal. It was down 10. So the strategy shifted from values-first influence to something much harder, heavier, and riskier. Infrastructure, the West's most serious attempt to compete in China's domain, arrived. Under the banner of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And its flagship African project became something called the Lobito Corridor. On paper, it sounds technical. In reality, it's strategic. The corridor is a rail and logistics push designed to connect the Atlantic port of Lobito in Angola to the mineral heartlands of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia. It involves refurbishing existing rail lines, building new connections, upgrading port capacity, and creating an alternative export route for copper and cobalt. Translation: a Western-lined exit door. a way to move critical minerals to global markets without being forced through the most China-influenced routes, ports, and processing ecosystems tied to the eastern side of the continent. And, unlike previous Western initiatives, this one comes with real money. Public commitments and independent analysis have cited roughly $4 billion from U.S.-linked financing, with total investment packages climbing towards $6 billion or more when multilateral banks and partner governments are included. On paper, it's exactly what critics have been demanding for years. Real assets, real steel, real alternatives. But here's the problem. The American way of building is slow. If you're an African president and you want a bridge built by China, the story you hear again and again goes like this. Sign the deal on Monday. Bulldozers show up by Friday. If you want a bridge built by the US or Europe, first comes the environmental impact study, then procurement, then compliance architecture, then labor standards reviews, then financing structures, then risk committees, then parliamentary approvals, then the paperwork's paperwork. 3 years later, you might get a shovel in the ground. Now, many of those checks are morally correct. Some prevent disasters, some protect communities. But in a race where supply chains determine national power, speed is a weapon. And that's what makes this contest so uncomfortable. Because while the US is trying to build the Lobito corridor, China is already moving on the other side of the board. Case in point, Beijing has signed multi-billion-dollar agreements to revamp the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, reinforcing an eastern mineral route that many analysts see as a direct counterweight to Lobito. Translation: China is playing speed chess. The West is playing correspondence chess by mail. There's an irony here that's almost painful. During the Cold War, United States used jazz diplomacies sending legends across Africa as cultural ambassadors, blending art, politics, and influence in ways that actually moved people. Today, the West is trying to win influence with compliance manuals. It's not quite as catchy, but Washington is betting everything on one advantage it still believes in: quality. Across parts of Africa, frustration with some Chinese-built projects has been growing. Complaints about workmanship, maintenance, and loan burdens have become politically toxic in certain capitals. This isn't universal, but it's common enough to matter. So the American bet is simple and risky. Eventually, enough leaders will get tired of cheap and fast if it comes with long-term pain. And when that moment hits, they'll prefer slow but sustainable. The Lobito corridor is the test case. If it works, the US gets back into the game not by speeches, but by proof. If it fails, the race may be over before it ever feels like one. And that raises a question that doesn't have a clean answer. If you're leading a developing nation and your people need jobs today, which partner do you pick? The one who brings money and bulldozers fast, asks no questions, and quietly locks up your resources for decades? Or the one who lectures you, takes forever, but builds something that lasts and doesn't chain you to one buyer? That dilemma doesn't end with railways. Because while superpowers argue about who controls the dirt and the steel, another player has quietly mastered the next layer of the game. Not mining, not building, cleaning. In the next section, we turn to the middleman, the one that turns messy. Violent resources into clean global money. Dubai, and the gold laundromat of the modern scramble. So far, we've talked about the giants. China, the builder. Russia, the enforcer. The United States, the latecomer trying to catch up with steel and standards. But there's a fourth player in this game. Not the king. Not the knight. The middleman. The one who doesn't need to dig the hole, guard the mine, or win the election. The one who controls the back door. The United Arab Emirates, more specifically. Dubai. Because while superpowers argue over who gets to extract resources, Dubai has quietly mastered the next step in the chain: how to turn messy, controversial minerals into clean global money. Here's the darkly ironic reality. You've heard of blood diamonds. We made a whole Hollywood movie about them. We built international mechanisms to stop conflict diamonds from entering legitimate markets. The Kimberley process exists precisely because diamonds were too easy to trace once public pressure built. But the resource that funds wars far more often the one that slides through the cracks with a straight face is gold. Gold has a superpower. Diamonds don't. Once it's melted down, it becomes anonymous. No serial numbers, no fingerprints. No, this bar funded a militia label. Just wait. Purity. A stamp. Now let's talk numbers, because this isn't speculation. A 2025 analysis by the Swiss NGO Swissaid, drawing on UN Comtrade-linked data, found that in 2024, the UAE imported 748 tons of gold from Africa, an 18% increase from the year before. Total gold imports into the UAE that year reached roughly 1,392 tons, putting Dubai among the world's largest gold import hubs. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Swissaid and other investigators point to a recurring pattern. The UAE imports massive quantities of gold from countries whose official production figures don't match the flow. Take Rwanda and Uganda. On paper, they are not major gold producers. Yet in 2024, the UAE imported 19 tons from Rwanda and 31 tons from Uganda countries, repeatedly described as key transit hubs for smuggled gold, including gold linked to conflict networks in eastern Congo. And then there's Sudan. Sudan is tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war. Gold has become one of the few remaining cash engines capable of funding armed groups and buying weapons. In 2024 alone, the UAE imported 29 tons of gold directly from Sudan, from 17 tons the year before, nearly 70%. Jump, while also importing significant volumes routed through neighboring countries like Egypt, Chad, and Libya. The pattern is consistent. Gold leaves conflict zones, moves through border states, arrives in Dubai, and then the transformation happens. The gold is refined, recast, stamped. Conflict gold becomes just gold. It enters bullion pipelines, jewelry markets, private vaults, supply chains that serve the entire planet. Not because everyone involved is evil, but because once gold is melted and mixed, proving origin becomes nearly impossible. And the global system is designed to keep commodities moving. This is where the laundromat metaphor earns its keep. The magic isn't the mining. The magic is the conversion, turning violence, instability, and smuggling into something clean enough to sit on a balance sheet. Dubai doesn't need to send troops into jungles. It doesn't need to win elections in African capitals. It just needs to own the plumbing, ports, refineries, logistics networks, trade hubs. Companies like DP World represent part of that advantage, connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia through terminals and supply chains that don't ask too many questions. In this sense, Dubai has become something like the Switzerland of the new Cold War. If Switzerland were built on oil money, sat at 110 degrees, and operated a gold market hungry enough to swallow a continent's shadows. And here's the unsettling truth. This isn't a side plot. Because the modern scramble isn't only about who owns the mines. It's about who owns the laundering layer. The place where dirty reality turns into clean capital. And if you think that's the end of the story, think again. Because resources aren't the only thing being contested in Africa anymore. The next battleground isn't underground. It's invisible. It's data. It's networks. It's the nervous system of modern states. In the next section, we move from dirt to digits to Huawei, telecommunications, and the quiet war over who gets to see, shape, and control the flow of information across an entire continent. So far, we've followed the dirt, the cobalt, the copper, the gold. Now we move to something far more subtle and far more powerful, the network. Because in the 21st century, if you control the minerals, you own the hardware. But if you control the network, you don't just own the hardware, you own the rules. You can watch the traffic, shape the traffic, throttle the traffic. And in moments of crisis, you can weaponize the traffic. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most unsettling spy stories of the modern era. The gift. In 2012, China gave the African Union a gift, a gleaming new headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. A modern glass and steel complex reportedly costing around $200 million, fully funded by Beijing. China paid for the concrete, the glass, the furniture, and this part matters most, the IT infrastructure inside the building. It was framed as a symbol of friendship. South-South cooperation, a monument to partnership, a free palace. What could possibly go wrong? The spike fast forward to early 2017. According to reporting that later exploded globally, IT staff at the African Union noticed something strange. Every night, between midnight and 2 a.m., their servers showed massive spikes in data traffic. The building was basically empty. So the obvious question became, where was the data going? The reporting alleged that confidential documents, internal communications, and sensitive files were being transferred to external servers, allegedly located in Shanghai. Not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly over years, from roughly 2012 until the activity was detected. If true, this wasn't a hack. It was a live feed. A vacuum cleaner quietly running in the heart of African diplomacy. China denied the allegations, calling them preposterous. The African Union publicly downplayed aspects of the story. But according to the same reporting, the O quietly responded by strengthening cybersecurity, replacing equipment, and tightening internal controls. And here's the part that matters most, regardless of where you land on the details. That building is just one building. The real story is the infrastructure outside its walls. The digital Silk Road. Huawei's footprint in African telecommunications is massive. Policy analysts and industry observers often estimate that Huawei has been involved in roughly 70% of Africa's 4G network build-out, along with deep presence in 3G backbones and early 5G deployments. Why? Because Huawei is fast, Huawei is cheaper. And crucially, Huawei bids are often paired with state-backed financing loans and credit structures Western vendors struggle to match. If you're a government with limited cash reserves, exploding demand for connectivity, and voters who want signal bars yesterday, the math is brutal. Nokia bids $100 million. Huawei bids $60 million with a friendly loan attached. You don't pick Huawei because you love Beijing. You pick Huawei because your budget is screaming and your streets are watching. This is the digital Silk Road, the network layer of China's global strategy. And it terrifies Washington for one simple reason. A network isn't just pipes, it's a potential control surface. Western governments have warned for years that Chinese-built telecom systems could create risks ranging from surveillance and espionage to influence over connectivity during protests, emergencies, or geopolitical crises. Some countries have even mandated the removal of Huawei equipment from core networks, citing national security concerns. Does that mean every Huawei router is a spy device? No. But geopolitics doesn't run on probably fine. It runs on worst-case capability, and capability is what matters. 'Cause once a network is embedded, replacing it isn't like deleting an app. It's billions of dollars, years of work, and a political nightmare. Who pays for it? So here's the uncomfortable conclusion. The digital Iron Curtain isn't something that might fall. In many places, it's already down. The cables are laid, the towers are built, the software is running. Which means the scramble for Africa is no longer just about who owns the mines or builds the roads. It's about who owns the nervous system of modern states. And every system eventually sends a bill. In the next section, we look at the morning after the debt hangover, the defaults, and the moment when the fun stops and the arithmetic begins. Every boom has a hangover. Infrastructure booms are no different. For most of the last decade, many African countries went on a borrowing spree. And honestly, you can't entirely blame them. If you have one of the youngest populations on Earth, unemployment breathing down your neck, and a once-in-a-generation chance to build power plants, roads, and railways, you take the money. Especially when global interest rates are near zero and lenders are lining up. Then 2020 hit. The pandemic didn't just slow economies, it slammed them into a wall. Tourism collapsed overnight, crippling countries that depended on it. Commodity prices whiplashed. Supply chains snapped. Governments burned through reserves just to keep the lights on. And just as many countries were gasping for air, the global financial climate flipped. The U.S. Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to fight inflation. For countries with dollar-denominated debt, that was a disaster. The same loan unchanged on paper suddenly cost far more to service. Not because of corruption. Not because of mismanagement. Because the world's financial center changed the price of money. The first domino to fall was Zambia. In November 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its sovereign debt in the COVID era. It wasn't uniquely reckless. It simply ran out of cash. And this is where the new Cold War stopped being abstract. In the old system, the script was familiar. A country defaults. It goes to the Paris Club loose group of mostly Western creditor governments. They negotiate. Debts are restructured. Everyone takes a haircut. Life moves on. This time, the room was crowded. Sitting at the table, whether invited or not, was a new, massive creditor, China. China doesn't operate on Paris Club traditions. When Zambia tried to restructure, the IMF and World Bank said, "We're willing to help, but only if all major creditors share the pain. We're not lending money just so it can be funneled straight to Beijing." China responded, "In effect, our loans are commercial. You caused global inflation. You raised rates. You take the haircut." What followed wasn't a negotiation. It was a standoff. China didn't want to set a precedent for large write-downs. Western lenders refused to move without China. And Zambia sat in the middle. Frozen, project stalled. Foreign investment dried up. The currency weakened. Inflation surged. Eventually, China did engage through multilateral frameworks, but slowly, grudgingly, and with enough friction to turn Zambia into a cautionary tale. While the elephants fought, the grass got trampled. Imagine you're a nurse in Lusaka. You haven't been paid in months because government accounts are locked in debt negotiations. You go to the pharmacy for medicine for your child. The price has tripled because the currency collapsed. You open the newspaper. On the front page, diplomats argue about debt sustainability frameworks. That doesn't put food on the table. This is the real debt trap. Not ports being seized at gunpoint. That story is often exaggerated. The real trap is paralysis. When no creditor wants to blink first, the country freezes. And Zambia is not alone. Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, others walk a financial tightrope where, in some years, interest payments consume more public money than healthcare or education. And here comes the dark twist. The West's new solution. Green bonds, climate finance, sustainability-linked loans. In theory, noble. In practice, still toughened layered on top of countries already struggling to breathe. It's like offering a drowning man a glass of water. Which brings us to a dangerous misunderstanding. Africa is not a passive victim in this story. And the biggest mistake Western media makes is treating the continent like a chessboard silent, static, waiting for moves. That era is over. Because African leaders have learned the lesson history taught them the hard way. Never depend on one patron. In the next section, we meet the new strategy shaping the scramble, the geopolitical bachelor. A generation of leaders playing everyone, committing to no one, and turning superpower fear into leverage. If there's one idea that changes how you see this entire story, it's this. Africa is not a chessboard anymore. It's a market, and the players on that market are not naive. For too long, Western narratives treated African countries like passive terrain, like it was still 1884, and the locals were simply watching empires draw lines. That assumption is not just outdated, it's wrong. This generation of African leaders, whether you admire them or not, has read the history. They understand the cost of dependency. They know that relying on a single patron isn't partnership, it's suicide. So they're doing what any rational actor would do in a world where multiple superpowers all need something you have. They're playing the field. Political scientists call this active non-alignment a modern version of the Cold War concept. Not about staying neutral, but about being aggressively opportunistic. Engage everyone. Commit to no one. Extract maximum leverage. In plain language, I'm taking money from everybody and I'm married to nobody. Look at Kenya. President William Ruto walks into Washington with democracy vocabulary loaded, suit pressed, smile ready. And during the push to deepen U.S.-Kenya ties, major digital infrastructure announcements, land plans involving billion-dollar data centers and cloud ecosystems. Then Kenya turns around and keeps the door open to Chinese infrastructure and financing. Why? Because you don't build a modern economy by having only one friend. Security tells the same story. Countries that don't want American jet sand don't want Russian. Mercenaries have increasingly turned to Turkey's drones. They're cheaper, effective enough, and politically easier to acquire. Russia pushes grain diplomacy, shipping food to African states in a world where hunger has become geopolitical leverage. India pitches digital public infrastructure systems for identity. payments, and data that promise to leapfrog legacy Western financial plumbing. Gulf states invest in farmland, logistics, and food supply chains because they understand the math of deserts and dependency. This isn't confusion, it's optimization. African leaders know the U.S. is terrified of losing influence to China. They know China is terrified of losing access to minerals. So they take that fear and turn it into a bidding war. And sometimes it works. Take the Democratic Republic of Congo. Remember the massive mining for infrastructure deal signed in 2008? Critics argued the infrastructure delivery lagged far behind the value of what was being extracted. So Kinshasa pushed back. Under President Felix Tshisekedi, the Congolese government demanded renegotiation roads, hospitals, real infrastructure, not just promises. And in January 2024, reporting confirmed that Chinese partners agreed to invest billions more in infrastructure and revise royalty terms. Why did China bend? Because cobalt and copper are no longer optional. They're strategic oxygen. And the DRC controls the tanks. This is the part Western narratives miss. Sometimes the prize holds the cards. But playing the field is dangerous. If you miscalculate, you don't just lose money. You get sanctions, destabilization, coups. And that brings us to the most volatile variable in this entire equation. Not minerals, not debt. People. In the next section, we confront the real resource everyone is scrambling for Africa's youth. Why demographics may decide whether the 21st century is stable or explosive. We've spent hours talking about rocks, cobalt, copper, gold, lithium. But the most important resource in Africa isn't buried underground. It's walking the streets, sitting in classrooms, looking for work, holding a phone. It's people land, more specifically, young people. Here is the demographic reality that keeps policymakers in aging societies awake at night. Japan's median age is around 50. Germany's is near 47. The United States hovers around 39 depending on the year. Africa's median age, about 19. That's not a statistic. That's a tsunami. By 2050, more than 1 in 4 human beings on Earth is projected to be African. Nigeria alone is expected to surpass the population of the United States, turning a single country into a demographic superpower. And this matters because modern economies don't run on speeches. They run on workers. Nurses, engineers, factory hands, coders, caregivers, construction crews. The rest of the world is aging. China's workforce is shrinking. Europe is aging fast. Even the United States faces serious headwinds without migration. Africa is becoming the largest reservoir of young human capital on the planet, which means the scramble is no longer just about minerals. It's about the human future. And that creates 2 roads. 2 versions of 2050. Path 1, the engine of the world in this future. The great powers do something rare. They invest beyond extraction. Factories rise near mines. Processing happens locally. Skills compound. Wages circulate. The youth wave becomes a demographic dividend. A rising middle class. A manufacturing boom. A services economy. A tech ecosystem that doesn't just export talent, it absorbs it. Silicon Savannah stops being a slogan. It becomes a skyline. Path 2, the time bomb in the other future. The scramble stays extractive. Minerals leave, jobs don't appear. Debt piles up. Opportunity evaporates. You create the most dangerous political chemistry on Earth. Hundreds of millions of young people connected, educated enough to know what they're missing, and locked out of opportunity. They don't stay put. Migration pressure explodes. Europe is already seeing the preview. And it's just that, a preview. Desperation becomes geopolitical. Russia understands this well. Migration pressure has already been used as a hybrid tool, nudging flows toward borders to create political stress and fracture societies. The weapon isn't always a missile. Sometimes it's demography. And when governance collapses, displacement follows. When displacement follows, pressure follows, and foreign actors exploit it. That's the real endgame. Not who wins the EV market, but whether the world in 2050 is stable or a fortress planet, rich nations behind walls, surrounded by permanent crisis. And that brings us to the final thought experiment. 2 futures, same starting point, very different endings. In the next and final section, we fast forward to 2050 and ask the only question that matters now. Was Africa the battlefield of the 21st century, or the place where it finally learned how to win? Let's end this the only honest way. Not with a prediction, not with a prophecy, with a simulation. Based on everything we've seen, the mines, the debt, the networks, the mercenaries, the youth fast forward 25 years and imagine two very different Africas. Same starting point, same resources, same demographics. Two radically different outcomes. Timeline 1. Resource Curse 2.0. It's the year 2050. The electric vehicle revolution is complete. Gasoline cars are museum pieces. The air in New York, Beijing, and Berlin is cleaner than it's been in a century. The green transition worked, just not everywhere. In the Congo, cobalt and copper are still being extracted, but now the mines are guarded by semi-autonomous security drones supplied by whichever defense contractor won the last tender. The perimeter is secure. Production numbers look great. Outside the fence, the local population lives in vast peripheral zones in formal cities pressed up against extraction sites they will never enter. Not because they lack ambition, but because access is controlled. The wealth moves outward. The people don't. Governments still exist, but mostly on paper. They collect fees, sign contracts, and suppress unrest. Real decisions are made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. The internet is fractured. Some countries operate inside tightly regulated, state-aligned digital ecosystems. Others run on Western platforms open in theory, surveilled in practice. Same cables. Different rules. Different masters. Africa exports minerals. Africa imports finished goods. Africa absorbs the environmental and social cost. The resources are gone. The holes remain. Timeline 2. The value-add revolution now rewind. Same continent, same cobalt. Same lithium. Same youth explosion. But this time, African leaders played the bachelor game perfectly. Foreign investment wasn't banned. It was conditioned. No refinery, no deal, no processing jobs, no license, no technology transfer. Walk away. China wanted cobalt. The US wanted supply chain security. Europe wanted green credentials. So Africa set the terms. By 2050, batteries aren't just mined in Africa. They're manufactured there. Zambia and the DRC host major processing hubs. Nigeria and Kenya assemble vehicles, electronics, and energy systems. Industrial clusters grow around logistics, energy, and skills. The Lobito Corridor isn't just a railway. It's the spine of a transcontinental trade network, linking inland production zones to multiple coasts, markets, and shipping lanes. The youth wave doesn't explode. It compounds. Jobs turn demographics into demand. Demand turns scale into power. Africa becomes one of the largest consumer markets on Earth. Not a battlefield, a boardroom. Not perfect, but sovereign. So, which timeline are we on right now? We're drifting toward the first. Extraction is still faster than industrialization. Debt is still easier than equity. Power still prefers weak partners. But there's a wild card. The agency of this generation of African leaders, and the desperation of the West not to help Africa, but to not lose to China. That combination might be strong enough to bend the arc. The future isn't written yet, but the clock is running. And by 2050, the world will find out whether Africa was just the battlefield of the 21st century, or the place where it finally learned how to win. Final thoughts, the device revisited. So what does all of this mean for you? It means the green future we're being sold comes with a price tag, and right now, we're not the ones paying it. We want the electric car. We want the AI assistant. We want the smartphone that arrives tomorrow wrapped in cardboard and convenience. But we don't want to look at the supply chain that makes it possible. We like to pretend these things appear by magic. They don't. They come from the red earth of the Congo, from contracts signed in ministries and boardrooms, from negotiations in Beijing, Washington, Moscow, and Dubai. The new scramble for Africa isn't history repeating itself. It's history accelerating. The West slept through the opening lap. China didn't just show up early, built the track. Russia isn't trying to win the race. trying to set parts of the stadium on fire. And in the middle of it all, African societies are trying to extract a future from a system that was never designed in their favor. The next time you plug in your phone, the next time your car glides silently away from the curb, take a second to think about where the energy and the metal that holds it actually comes from. Because the battery doesn't just store charge, it stores labor, it stores power, it stores choices. And whether we admit it or not, it stores the fate of the 21st century.